So let me just introduce John Vervaeke, for those of you who don't know him. He's the head of Cognitive Science Department at the University of Toronto and has published a YouTube series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and wrote Zombies in Western Culture, a 21st Century Crisis. And he will be presenting on the 3 questions of consciousness. His conversations with other people, including some of the speakers here, have embodied the spirit of what we hope this conference will bring, which is that we can disagree over matters of substance while remaining open, curious, and respectful with one another. So John, if you want to come up.
Thank you, Catherine, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I've been traveling a lot this summer, all over the place, but the thought of being here, especially in person with Jonathan and Paul, has been constantly on my mind. So it's great that it's finally realized. So, 3 questions of consciousness. Consciousness is the whole... It's a sign that we're not supposed to talk about consciousness. We okay now?
Yeah, my bad.
Okay. So, as I was saying, and I mentioned Holy Grail, and there was a noise, Jonathan's going to make a lot out of that. What is consciousness? Like I said, this is the Holy Grail. This is the hardest question in cognitive science. And what I'm not going to do, what you might expect, is I'm not going to give you a definition, because that is precisely what is at issue. That's precisely what is at issue. Okay. Instead, what I want to start with is what I call precise pointing. I want to talk about 5 things that point to consciousness, and we can sort of understand the nexus point where they all point in common. That's what we're pointing to more precisely when we're trying to point at consciousness. So this nexus of 5 pointers, what are the 5 pointers? First is awakeness. Sorry, there's going to be a lot of these, nest-sounding words because we're talking about consciousness. Awakeness, this is what happens when you wake up. You're alert and you're attentive. You know what that is, okay? There's awareness. You are capable of receiving information from the environment and recognize it in some way. There's access. You know what it was like a minute ago when you were not thinking of Africa, and now you're thinking of Africa. You've accessed it. You've brought it into so you can use it in your mind. It's gone from being unconscious to conscious. And there's authority or authorship. You feel that it is your consciousness. I feel it is my consciousness. It's private to me and I direct it. And it's somehow I own it. So awakeness, awareness, access, authority, and then finally, the 5th one, aspectuality. There's 2 aspects to aspectuality. One is we see things under aspects. I see this as a glass. I could see it as a weapon, but I see it as a glass right now. Right? And then the other are aspects of my experience. These are the things much beloved of philosophers called qualia. Qualia is just a plural for qualities or properties. And so these are things like the greenness of green in your experience, the felt quality of what's it like to experience greenness. So there's the aspectuality of the environment, and there's the aspectuality of the experience. So one more time, awakeness, awareness, access, authorship or authority, and aspectuality. Now I would argue, I propose, that any account of consciousness must explain and integrate those 5 pointers if we're going to make any progress towards coming to be able to define consciousness. Now, in order to generate such an account, there are 3 questions that need to be addressed. I'm going to review these questions and then we'll sort of tackle them in a certain manner. The first question is the nature question. The way you can ask this question is, how does consciousness, and there's 3 options here, how does consciousness exist in, emerge from, or emanate into non-conscious stuff? There's lots of non-conscious stuff around, and there's variation. It emerges out of the non-conscious stuff, it emanates into it, it exists in it in some fashion. Now, there's a lot of ink spilled on that, but these These three options have surprisingly similar problems, so I'm going to group them together under the nature question. Basically, what is it, how is it that consciousness exists in real relationship to non-conscious stuff? That's the nature question. Because consciousness is weird. It's not like the other stuff we're familiar with. So that's the first question, the nature question. The second question is the function of consciousness. What does consciousness do? And this is a very interesting question because you probably you find your consciousness very, very valuable. You wouldn't want to part with it. If I said you get to be extremely wealthy and everybody loves you, but you just can't be conscious of it, do you take the deal? You go, no, I don't want that deal. Right? Okay, so, but then if I ask you, what does your consciousness do? And before you answer, I want you to note a few things. And this is around another philosophical topic, and I've got to mention zombies at least once. This is called the problem of why are you not a philosophical zombie? Okay, so let's try and make, what do I mean by philosophical zombie? So remember when you first learned to drive and you're very conscious and you're very aware, and then you've been driving for 20 years and you've been driving for about 15 minutes and you realize, oh, I haven't been paying attention at all to the highway. It's called highway hypnotism. How many of you have ever done that? Okay, so you can do a very, very sophisticated thing that we still can't give to autonomous cars. They're still failing, and you can do that without consciousness. Think about how sophisticated that is. You are taking the noises coming out of my face hole and turning them into ideas in your mind. And do you know how you do that? No, because all the intervening steps are unconscious to you. Let's make it a little bit more interesting. There's a real phenomenon called blindsight. Blindsight is when people, by the way, an excellent science fiction book by Peter Watts, a Canadian, Okay, so make sure you read it at some point. Blindsight. People are experientially blind. They sincerely, authentically, I can't see, I'm blind. And then you can do things like say, well, just guess. I'm holding up a finger somewhere near you. Where is it and what angle is it at? And they'll say, I don't know. Stop being a jerk. I'm blind. Just guess. Oh, it's there and it's like horizontal. And you go, whoa. They can accurately detect and locate and orient even though they have no qualitative experience. That's called blindsight. So again, what is consciousness doing if so much of what you do in your intelligent behavior is being done without consciousness? That's the function problem. This is the problem of why are you not a philosophical zombie? So that's the second question. The third question is a meta question. What is the relationship between the nature and function questions? Are they independent from each other? Is one dependent on the other? Or are they interdependent with each other? So I'm going to start with the third question because it's more of a methodological question, and I'm going to answer it in terms of just nature and function before considering specific theories. One thing you might think is that the nature and function questions are independent from each other. This is a very prevalent strategy in a lot of the existing literature, but it's very rarely justified. There's no philosophical argument saying this is why you should do it. Sometimes when it's justified as it's easier to do this. And again, without any sort of good argument as to that being the case. Sometimes people have the independence because they have a prior commitment to a worldview and a nature of consciousness. And that, of course, is something that people can take up. Of course, they sacrifice something. If you take a worldview that requires that these questions are independent from each other and privileges consciousness in this way, you're not going to be then able to use consciousness to explain or justify your worldview because you previously committed to the worldview in order to constrain your theory of consciousness. So all of that generally, I think, tells against treating them as independent. I think it's very implausible that the two questions are independent for the very good reason that they don't seem to be independent anywhere else. We don't seem to be able to talk about the function of anything without at some point grounding it in the nature of the thing. And we don't seem to be able to talk about the nature of something without talking about how it acts or interacts or functions in the world. And of course, some of you know that Thomas Aquinas made a very powerful argument for that. We have a Thomas Aquinas fan, okay? Okay. And of course, this is why we even often use words like reality and actuality as if they're synonyms, etc. So they're not independent. One thing you might say is, well, the nature question should be answered first. The problem with that is if you say, I'm going to talk about the nature without talking about the function, you're actually separating nature from actuality. You're separating something's nature from how it acts. You're separating its nature from how it interacts. This position is very epistemologically suspect, because basically you're saying something can exist although it doesn't act or interact with other things. The technical name for this is epiphenomenalism, and epiphenomenalism, I think, is an incoherent position. The idea that something can exist and not have effects is like, how would you know that it exists? How could you possibly distinguish it from not existing, et cetera, et cetera? So the arguments against that epiphenomenal conclusion are long-standing, and I think they're persuasive. So I think prioritizing the nature question, I think, is very, very implausible. Well, maybe we'll do the function first. Just what's the function? And we'll worry about solving the hard problem of consciousness later. This is a very, very popular view, or I should say popular approach in a lot of the scientific literature on consciousness. We'll leave that hard problem over there and we'll just figure out what consciousness does. The problem with that is, as far as I can tell from the existing literature on functionalism, both modern and ancient, Aristotelian, function depends on constraints given to you by the medium, given to you by the stuff that is implementing the function, and it's putting constraints. So like if you try and play chess with little puffs of smoke, you're in a lot of trouble, because they have to have certain features or you can't manipulate them the way you need to manipulate them. So I therefore propose that the two questions have to be answered in an integrated manner. They can't be treated independently. You can't make one dependent on the other. Therefore, they have to be answered in an integrated, interdependent manner. And I think that puts some important constraints on the kinds of answers we can give. Theories of the nature of consciousness that do not produce an account of the function should be rejected. I think panpsychism, and I don't want to do a talk just on panpsychism, I think panpsychism fails from that problem. It makes consciousness a fundamental property of nature and then is incapable of explaining its function. It's incapable of explaining why the consciousness of this table doesn't produce intelligent, rational behavior, and the consciousness of this piece of matter produces intelligent, rational behavior. Okay. Theories of function that do not ground in an account of nature should also be rejected. And I'm going to show you that one of the most prominent theories of today, the global workspace theory, is just such a theory. So what I want to do, now that we've got some constraints on how we're going to look at these theories, I want to look at what are some of the prominent cognitive scientific theories of consciousness. I can't survey all of them. Every second Tuesday, a new theory of consciousness emerges. And I teach a course on consciousness, and just keeping up with that literature is both demanding and boring, because a lot of the theories are not very good. Because scientists, there's a lot of good science, but there's a lot of scientists who think consciousness is the thing you can just sort of speculate about. That's all you need to do. I'm going to review the ones that are central and important, prominent, influential. That's my criterion, right? So the first is one I just mentioned a few minutes ago. It's by Bars. It's called the global workspace theory. And the basic idea, there's two analogies for trying to explain how consciousness functions. So he says that consciousness functions like your desktop on your computer. So the files are like your unconscious parts of your brain, and then what you do is you access them. Remember that access was one of the features of consciousness, right? One of the pointers, I should say. You access that, you bring it into the workspace. Now it's active, and you can manipulate and transform it, and then you can globally broadcast it back to other parts of your memory, your behavior, your motivation. Another way he does it is consciousness is like a theater. There's all kinds of people sitting in the dark. That's one part of unconscious. There's people working behind the scenes. That's in the dark. There's the stage, that's working memory, and then attention is the spotlight. Horrible metaphor for attention, by the way. But attention is the spotlight, and where attention shines on the stage so that the actors can come out of the darkness and interact with each other and carry on the play. That's consciousness. It's a powerful theory. It's extremely popular, very prevalent. Dehaene and others have been able to find neurological empirical support for the theory. There seem to be like areas that everything is getting bused to when you're doing consciousness, etc. Now, on the two questions, Bars is explicitly silent about the nature question. He says he has no answer to the nature question, no answer about the hard problem of consciousness. Okay? He's very explicit about the function. In fact, that's what he thinks the main value of his theory is. So what is the function? He said it in many places, but the paper that I think is most pivotal is one he published with Shanahan and Bars 2005, where they argued directly and explicitly, their thesis is that the function of consciousness is to solve the frame problem. So some of you might know about the frame problem, but the fact that Shanahan is in that, he's actually first author on that paper is important, because Shanahan is like the world authority on the frame problem. I won't tell you what the frame problem is because I want to actually do Shanahan's analysis. There's two problems in the frame problem. One is, how do I give a computer the ability to represent change without falling into all kinds of paradoxical issues in its computation? Very hard problem, and it's largely been solved, largely by this guy named Shanahan. And then he says, once you solve that aspect of the frame problem, the bigger, deeper problem remains. What does he call that problem? He calls it the relevance problem. The deepest problem that remains when you get rid of the technical aspect of the frame problem is the relevance problem. Some of you may know that I have sort of a passing interest in relevance realization. Okay? So how, of all of the information you pay attention to, do you zero on the relevant information? All the information you could call from working memory, from long-term memory, especially all the possible combinations, which do you access? Many of you are familiar with this, so I'm not going to go into this. I keep publishing on this. I've just published 3 weeks ago another paper integrating relevance realization theory and predictive processing theory. So there's lots out there you can read. There's lots you can watch. I mean, just stand near me for 25 minutes and relevance realization will by osmosis get into you. Okay, but that is the explicit conclusion. Okay, so let's look at another theory that comes at it from consciousness from exactly the opposite direction in terms of the three questions. This is Tononi's integrated information theory. So what's the theory here? So compare your eye to a TV screen. TV screen is a picture, but what's happening in any one pixel is not causally connected to what's happening in any other pixel. If you compare your eye, what's happening in one part of your retina is actually causally connected to the other parts of your retina. So there's mutual information, mutual causation, there is and mutual prediction between. So the information in your retina is being integrated in a way in which it's not being integrated in the picture on your TV screen. That's why understanding consciousness, by the way, as a picture is a fundamentally flawed metaphor. He has a formal mathematical way, and I could teach you, and if you come to take the course with me at the University of Toronto, I would teach you the technical way in which you can actually calculate how much integrated information there is in a system. He calls it by the Greek letter phi, and you can actually calculate how conscious, according to him, an organism is by paying attention to the phi degree that you could calculate for its brain. So apparently bees are quite conscious, according to him, which is kind of interesting. So first, a couple of qualifications. He calls it an integrated information theory, but it's not really integrated information. Consciousness is the integration of information that's already differentiated. If everything on your eye was like a white, homogeneous, it's called a Gonsfeld in psychology, all was white, phi goes down. So it's actually complexification. It's how much integration has brought how much differentiation into that integration. It's complexified. A system is complex if it is simultaneously highly differentiated, like your hand, and highly integrated, like your hand. When things are complexified, they can do many different things in a highly coordinated fashion without falling apart or losing their causal coherence, like your hand. If your hand was just differentiated, it would fall apart if you tried to use it. If it was just integrated, it would be a homogeneous blob and you couldn't do anything. But now I can do lots of complex behavior. And that's basically that's a good analogy of how he understands consciousness. Okay. Now, he's explicit that he is answering the nature problem and not discussing the function problem. Explicit, repeatedly so. Now, what does he got going for him in order to say I'm answering the nature problem? Well, his theory can explain two important features of consciousness that many people take to be central to consciousness. One is that consciousness has a powerful unity. You're having a state of consciousness right now, a single state of consciousness. It's not a homogeneous blob. It's not differentiated into pixelation. It is somehow complexified and one. Theory is a good account of that. Secondly, he can explain the center of subjectivity, why you feel that you are at the center of your field of consciousness. He explains this basically by the greatest complex, the part of your brain, the parts of your brain that have the highest phi value and are doing the most complexification, that is the center of your consciousness. That is the center of your subjectivity. So he has an account of two fundamental features of consciousness, unity and the center of subjectivity. So this is why his theory is taken seriously. But why the complexification occurs is unclear, because he's not trying to answer the function question. How it occurs is mysterious, because he's not trying to answer the function question. He does not explicitly address this, but we can get at the function question because he's done some interesting things. He has proposed a Turing test for consciousness. So many of you know what the Turing test is. How many of you saw The Imitation Game? It stars Benedict Cumberbatch, who stars in everything, right? And so that's about Alan Turing, and the Turing test was a way of you basically see if a human being can distinguish between the performance of a computer and another human being, and if the human being can't distinguish them, then you attribute as much intelligence to the computer as you do to the human being. There's lots of variations and problems. I just need you to understand the basic idea. So he proposes a Turing test for consciousness. What's the Turing test for consciousness? He says we give the system problems where it has to judge appropriateness. Like we show a picture to the system and there's a fish in a clear blue sky. Or there's a potted plant sitting with its leaves on the keys of a computer. And if the system can go basically, that's weird, then it's conscious, which tells you what's actually going on. He's saying you detect for consciousness by seeing if a system can detect for absurdity and irrelevance. So consciousness is a complexification that affords relevance realization. That's its function, because we know what its function is because it comes out as a direct implication of his test for consciousness. So Vervaeke and Ferraro in 2013 argued that relevance realization is itself a complexification process. The system is constantly toggling between integration, compressing data, differentiating, particularizing data. That's one way in which it gets an optimal grip. I won't go over all of that, but the idea of complexification that affords relevance realization is already extant in the literature, and I happen to have been the person who made that point, whatever that means. Okay, so notice we've got these two major theories, and you might say, well, maybe we should just put them together. Here's a nature theory and here's a function theory, and that's recently being done and being tried, but I don't think that is successful, and I want to give that theory a little bit more time before I comment on it. It doesn't in any way detract for the rest of my argument. Next kind of theory that's out there are called hot theories. Academics love to come up with these acronyms that indicate that they may actually have a sex life. So hot theory, it stands for higher order thought theory. This is the idea that an important feature of consciousness is recursion. You can be conscious of consciousness. There seems to be a deep intimacy between consciousness and self-consciousness. You should not always identify them, though, because it's probably quite plausible that cats are conscious, but they're not self-conscious. But there seems to be a deep feature, the recursive nature of consciousness. So what higher order thought theories basically argue is you get consciousness by having a higher order representation representing a lower order representation. The lower order representation represents the world, and then the higher order representation represents the representation. And when that happens, you get consciousness. That's the main idea. They're picking up an important aspect of consciousness, this recursive aspect. But the problem with that is that that relation between the orders is very tricky, because you have lots of those kinds of relations that are not conscious all of the time. So I take it that many of you believe there are cats, yes? That many of you believe that cats are mammals, yes? So you have a representation of cats that is also contains a representation of mammals. So the representation of cats also represents the representation mammal. Higher order representation, lower order representation. And yet you're not all day long conscious of cats are mammals, cats are mammals, cats are mammals. That would be hell, right? Okay, so a lot of people have realized, and even Rosenthal, who proposed the theory, he said the relation between the orders can't be causal or perceptual, and then people would say, what would it be? And he would say, not causal, not perceptual. Yes, but what would it be? Yes, not causal, not perceptual. Okay, and so it went on like that for a while. Other people have picked it up. Clearman's in the radical plasticity hypothesis, and you may want to take a look at this because he basically argues that you're not born conscious, you have to learn to be conscious. Really interesting idea, because what he basically says, the relationship between the lower order and the upper level is not a sharing of content. The lower order is learning about the pattern. Sorry, the higher order is learning about the lower order, very much like in predictive processing models, for those who are familiar with that, right? And so it's learning about this, and it also cares about it. It cares about it. So, learning and caring. I won't repeat arguments that I've made elsewhere, that when you put those two together, you're basically doing recursive relevance realization. Relevance realization is not cold calculation. It is caring about this information rather than that information. That is what distinguishes you from computers. They don't care about the information they're processing, you do. You care about this rather than that, and that helps you to learn because it helps you avoid combinatorial explosion and solve problems, etc., etc. So as soon as he invokes that, he's binding his account, that relation that is at the core of higher order thought theories, to recursive relevance realization. Bohr and Seth, they actually do something really interesting. So they make use of something I mentioned earlier. Remember when we talked about driving, and at first you're very conscious and then it passes into unconscious? And by the way, that's called automatic processing, no pun intended, about driving, right? But, right, and they asked, why is it that some of the tasks can be handled by our philosophical zombie, and why do they pass from ones requiring tremendous consciousness into virtual unconsciousness? And then sometimes why do we have to bring processes back into consciousness and not leave them running automatically? It's a good question, excellent question. So they review a lot of work. I don't have time to review it. You can read their work. But again, a lot of other people's work, including their own good experimental work, that the kind of tasks that require consciousness and that cannot be done automatically are tasks that are high in novelty, complexity, and basically being ill-defined. Ill-defined meaning you're not very clear on the initial state and the goal state of your problem that you're trying to solve. A well-defined problem is something like 24 times 3. You know what the initial state is. It's a multiplication problem. You know what the goal state looks like. You know what you're supposed to do. I'm supposed to do this. Singing doesn't matter, etc. An ill-defined problem is, I'm doing one right now. Give a good talk. When the talk was about to begin, there was silence. That doesn't help me very much. What does the end state look like? A good talk. Yes, but, right? It's an ill-defined problem. Right? Having a conversation is an ill-defined problem, telling a joke, going on a successful first date, knowing how far to stand from somebody at a funeral, etc., etc. Most real-world problems are ill-defined problems. So we need consciousness when problems are high in novelty, high in complexity, and high in ill-definedness. By the way, tell your kids to go into careers that deal with those kinds of problems, because those are the ones that are not going to be taken over by AI quickly. I kid you not. One of the best jobs to have for the AI revolution is being a philosopher. Okay? So what is consciousness doing recursively? What's it doing in order to help us deal with novelty, complexity, and ill-definedness? They talk about redescription strategies. What do they mean? They talk about a phenomenon called chunking. So, your spouse, your kids, pets, works of art, flammable material, explosives. Things you care about in a fire. Now they all belong together. Now if I didn't do that, things you care about in a fire, and I asked you 10 minutes from now, what, can you tell me all the things I listed? You'd go, spouse, pet. But now, if I ask you 10 minutes from now, you'll list it off, because you chunked it together. You found a way in which they're all relevant to each other and relevant to you. Chunking is enhanced relevance realization. Chunking is how you get things through the working memory bottleneck. Your working memory is where you hold things in your mind. You can hold, if I say to you, pig, cat, pterodactyl, you can hold that in mind. But if I say 17 things to you, you can't hold it all in mind. That's working memory. That's that access we were talking about earlier. Okay, so their idea is that what consciousness is doing it's doing recursive enhancement of relevance realization in order to help us deal with situations that place a high demand on relevance realization. What kind of situations place a high demand on relevance realization? Situations high in novelty, high in complexity, and high in ill-definedness, because those are the problems that foreground zeroing in on the relevant information. The connection to working memory brings this out. So and by the way, there's deep connections, as I said, between working memory and the global workspace theory. Remember, working memory was the stage in which global workspace worked. So, for a long time, we thought the function of working memory was holding, a holding function, with Miller and other people like that. Now, I was privileged to have a great colleague at the University of Toronto, Lynn Hasher, who spent her career, a lot of good theoretical argument, and a lot of experimental evidence that's showing the function of working memory is to exclude irrelevant information that is being given to you by your unconscious processes or by the world. The point of working memory is to be a higher order, recursive realizer of relevance. That's what working memory is. It takes information given up by unconscious processes or by the world and filters that information for how much relevance is in it. That's her work, not mine. Okay? So, what you have with this connection is you've got recursive relevance realization that is making information relevant to working memory. What is it when information is relevant to working memory? That is salience. That's what salience is. How things stand out to you and grab your online attention. It's for online problems. Online means right here, right now. Salience landscaping for current situations, online problems, many of you know, this is what I call, these are the defining features of perspectival knowing. This is knowing what it's like to be me here now in this state of mind in this situation. I'm doing a particular salience landscaping and it's online, and what I'm seeking is to be as present in this situation as I possibly can. That's the goal of perspectival knowing, to make me as connected as to the online as I possibly can be. Now, I could review other theories. If you want to see other theories reviewed, watch my online series with Greg Enriquez, Untangling the World Knot. That was the name that Schopenhauer gave to the problem of consciousness, the world knot. And we go over many more of these theories. So I'm asking for a bit of trust, but you can follow up if you wish. There is a massive convergence. This is what I'm trying to show you. There is a massive convergence between all these different theories that the function of consciousness is to do recursive relevance realization that affords perspectival knowing. I've presented this at the conferences and such, and I have not had a significant challenge to this, because once you, sorry, I'm not trying to claim I'm a genius or no, why don't the rest of the people see my brilliance? That's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is once you just sit down and just take the time to think about these questions, the function question, the nature question, put these things before you, instead of immediately jumping into what's consciousness, you say, well, what are all the theories of consciousness doing? Are they talking about nature or function? And what are all the ones that function doing? And oh, look, they're all converging on this. We should pay attention to that. We should pay attention to that. Now, you can back this up with two important empirical things. More, but there's at least two. Here's the first. It's called multiple object tracking, the work of Zen and Polition. So you get a computer screen, and you can have things moving around on it, like a red X, a purple 0, different letters, different colors, and they're moving around. And you can ask people to track, right? Track the red X, track the purple 0. Keep tracking the red X and the purple 0. Now what's amazing is you can track 8 things, which is more than working memory, which tells you something. It tells you that you're actually learning more than from the environment than just what is in your working memory. That's important. Empirical confirmation about implicit learning, intuition, etc. Put that aside, but remember that it's important. But for our purposes, what's really cool is when you get people to max out at the 8 things, they can't tell any difference in the thing when if you change it. What do you mean, John? What I mean is, if this started out as a red X and it turns into a purple 0 and then into a blue B, they don't know that. They don't notice that. They do not know that. He calls it fingers of instantiation. It's like you're putting a finger on it and tracking it. Like I don't know what this is, but I can follow it wherever it goes. Now that's really interesting, because all they're getting is here-ness, now-ness, and the ability that these various moments of here-ness and now-ness go together. I can track where the thing is. Here, now-ness, and tracking, and no other content. He says that this is analogous to, in linguistics, what is called demonstrative reference. So most reference is semantic-based. We give a content to the term, and then we think of the thing because of it. Like cat, and you think land shark with brains that pretends to love you, right? Cat, okay? But demonstrative reference is when I sort of did it at the beginning, I sort of mixed them. Demonstrative reference is when you point, either verbally or in gesture, this. Notice that this doesn't mean anything. All that this means is put a finger on this. Salience, tag it. Here, nowness, togetherness, so you can track it. That's it. And he points out that has to be primordial. It has to be primary. Why? Because if I'm going to categorize things, I have to take things that I've not yet categorized and put them together in my mind. I have to go this, and now they're together, they're co-salient, and now you can start to form the category, container, etc. It's pre-conceptual. It's pre-experiential. And I won't repeat arguments I've made elsewhere, that relevance realization is similarly pre-representational, pre-conceptual, pre-experimental. But notice that you have experimental evidence for this and a clear argument as to why this is central to your cognitive functioning. It's primary, it's primordial. Here nowness tracking. Before any green, blue, yellow, apple, beautiful. Here nowness tracking. In deep meditation, and I've realized this state, and that doesn't mean anything about me, other than I've realized it like many other people, it's called the pure consciousness event. In the pure consciousness event, you are not conscious of anything. You're not even conscious of consciousness. You are just purely conscious, hence the name. is widely documented, widely attested, and both cross-culturally and cross-historically. Okay? To doubt this, if you were to doubt this on the basis of a report, you'd have to doubt the existence of Napoleon, because we have more reports for this than we do for Napoleon. Okay? Now, what's very powerful about this experience is you don't black out. You're not even conscious of yourself. You don't have that little voice, I am John, I am John, I am John. Well, you don't have that voice. That'd be creepy, but you know what I mean. Okay? There's no adjectival qualia. There's no qualia, just like multiple object tracking. There's no greenness, no blueness, no yellowness, no apple, no cat, not even John, not even consciousness. But it's not completely empty of qualia, like Foreman claims. Foreman's making a mistake. He's the person that writes about it. Because you don't black out. And if you talk to people and you say, what was it like? They can tell you what it was like. There was perspectival knowing. And they will say, I touched eternity. Notice what that is. It's pure absolute nowness. I felt it was just pure presence, here-ness. It was oneness, togetherness, and unity. Those qualia don't disappear. We need to make a distinction. The usual qualia talked about and beloved by philosophers, greenness, blueness, yellowness, they're gone. But the adverbial qualia, here-ness, nowness, togetherness, still exist in the multiple object tracking and in the pure consciousness event. They don't go away. What does that tell us? It tells us right away that adjectival qualia are not necessary for consciousness. They can be absent and consciousness still exists. Giving you the proof. Neither are they sufficient. The adjectival qualia, without the adverbial qualia, imagine if you just had sort of completely disconnected, I can't even spatialize it, blips of yellowness or blueness, and there's no adverbial qualia. There's no sense of them belonging together, having a here-ness, a nowness, togetherness. You can't make them salient. You can't track them in any way. I would put it to you that that's not consciousness, because that state is incapable of explaining the 5 pointers. If all I have is that, I can't explain awakeness, I can't explain alertness, etc., etc. The adjectival qualia are neither necessary nor sufficient, which means technically and rigorously they are not essential to consciousness. It is possible to have consciousness without them. Adverbial qualia are necessary. There is no thing we can point to where they're absent and yet consciousness is present. Adverbial qualia are sufficient to explain consciousness. How do you explain awakeness? Well, you're tracking the world. That's what awakeness is. Awareness. Adverbial qualia make categorization possible, make recognition possible. I showed you that a few minutes ago with the multiple object tracking. Access. Well, they give access to working memory, global workspace. Authority. So what I'm trying to get you to realize is that the adverbial qualia are perfectly explainable given recursive relevance realization. It does the salience tagging that gives you the here-ness, the nowness, the togetherness, the tracking, the ability to start categorizing, etc., etc. And relevance, recursive relevance realization, that's affording perspectival knowing, gives you authority. It gives you a center, because things in a very real sense are relevant to me and not relevant to you. In the sense that I am a center of a perspective. What is a perspective? It's how I'm here now and holding things together. That's what a perspective is. Perspective doesn't have to have any particular content to be a perspective. It's not defined by its adjectival content. It's defined by its adverbial qualia. So what have I been trying to show you? I've given you an integrated account of the function of consciousness. It's recursive relevance realization that affords perspectival knowing. That recursive relevance realization affording perspectival knowing gives us adverbial qualia. It allows us to explain the 5 pointers in an integrated fashion. And it explains a lot of the phenomenology of consciousness, an integrated account of the function and the nature questions. It also helps to explain things that we have wide evidence for, but the other theories don't explain well. People routinely calibrate their assessment of consciousness with their assessment of flexibility of intelligence. How much an organism displays in its intelligence the ability to deal with novelty, ill-definedness, complexity. So if I ask you if an ant is conscious, you I don't know. But what about the whole, colony? You might, well, maybe, because they sort of solve problems, but I don't know. But, well, what about a cat? Yeah, a cat's probably conscious, because you actually interweave these deeply together. It's very strong intuitions. Very, very strong intuitions. And yet, we can either think that intuition, like a lot of our intuitions, has no basis, or it might be that our intuition is actually implicitly tracking a lot of complex patterns of function and nature, and actually realizing their deep interdependence. And I've tried to provide you with an account that does that. So I have been putting my proverbial neck on the line because I have tried to give you an integrated answer to the nature and function of consciousness that is scientifically viable right now, given the current state of cognitive science. So thank you very much for your time and attention.